Good sequels are by no means a given. Finding the right balance between what came before, what made the original great, and expanding on it enough that it has a great impact, and yet still retaining the feel and essence of what made the original deserving of a sequel in the first place. It's not always the easiest line to walk, and it's fair to say there have been good and bad examples of video game sequels down the years. For every Super Punch-Out which took the formula of the original Punch-Out and expanded on it enough to make it fresh, there's a Super Mario Bros. 2 outside of Japan that takes the brilliance of the original and, well, fucks it all up. For every Street Fighter 2, there's a Dark Souls 2. For every Speedball 2, there's an Overwatch 2. For every Resident Evil 2, there's a Zelda 2. It just serves to remind you that just because an original game is outstanding, there are never any guarantees about the sequel. In my original Streets of Rage retrospective, I told you it was a, quote, stone cold classic. And it really is. Even 30 plus years after release, it still felt excellent to play. It still felt responsive and smooth, it still looked and sounded the part, and it was an absolute blast to play through again. But that was only the first chapter, the opening salvo. Let us jump forward in time from 1991 to late 1992 America and early 1993 Europe, and the launch of another game in the 2D side-scrolling beat the fuck out of anything that moves genre. Because this, my friends, is Streets of Rage 2. The game is set a year after Axel, Blaze and Adam beat Mr. X to death in a skyscraper in downtown Wood Oak City. After their merciless victory, Adam goes back to work for the police, Axel becomes a bodyguard, and Blaze starts being a dance instructor. But despite the peace, the tranquility and the prosperity they enjoy, like any good baddie, Mr. X somehow rises from the grave.
Rise from your grave.
Kidnaps Adam, relocates to some island he somehow owns, and his gang take over the city again. Axel and Blaze return to the fold to save their buddy. Axel brings along a wrestler mate called Hager. Max. He's called Max. Max Thunder in America and Japan, but Max Hatchet in Europe. And also tagging along for the ride is Adam's kid brother Skate, who is called Sammy Hunter in Japan, but Eddie Hunter in America and Europe, while Axel is still Axel, Blaze is still Blaze, and Mr. X is still Elon. Right, are we all following that? Good. Following on from the original, which was both a critical and commercial smash hit, Sega just had to make a second game. I mean, let's be honest, Sega made some pretty questionable decisions in this era of gaming, like trying to support the Master System, the Game Gear, the Pico, the MegaDrive, the Mega CD, and the 32X, all while trying to sell you a Sega Saturn, just as an example. Yep, there were some serious questions you could have asked of Sega at the time. But even early 1990s, Sega realised that Streets of Rage couldn't be a one-and-done game. It needed a sequel, and they diligently set to work pretty much straight after the first game shipped on making the second. The legendary soundtrack designer from the original, Yuzo Koshiro, and his sister Ayano, had set up a studio called Ancient, which by the way still exists to this day, and took on the design planning and lead graphic designer roles, as well as the soundtrack duties for the new game. While many comparisons with Final Fight were favourable towards Streets of Rage, the graphics were definitely one area that Final Fight on the Super Nintendo was the clear winner. Much larger sprites, better animation, and much more detailed backdrops. Sega knew this, and they set out to make some stark visual improvements to the game with Ancient, before handing it over to the original Streets of Rage team for programming duties. Now, in order to fit the graphical overhaul, the newly developed music, and the new combat mechanics, Sega had to significantly increase the amount of space on the cartridge, and thus Streets of Rage 2 was the first 16 megabit cart on the MegaDrive, which was 4 times the size of the original Streets of Rage cartridge. Now look, I know that 2 megabytes doesn't sound like much today, and it isn't, but back in the early 1990s, this was a big deal. Console warring fanboys automatically assumed that bigger meant better, when in reality, as my wife endlessly assures me, it doesn't mean that at all. Have a look at how much space Call of Duty takes up on your PS5, and then tell me that that is a better game than the countless other games that don't eat a quarter of a fucking terabyte on your hard drive. But console warring fanboy bullshit aside, what the extra space did mean is that Sega could fit all of these improvements into Streets of Rage 2. And the moment you boot into the game, those improvements are immediately apparent. The sprites are so much taller than the original, and they're so much better animated than the original. Now, for those of you who may be more insecure about sizes, I will point out that Axel is still not as tall as Cody in Final Fight. However, one of the biggest criticisms of Final Fight I had was how, with your player and 3 big enemies on the screen at once, it felt somewhat claustrophobic at times. Any beat-em-up player will tell you that the key to being good at these games is understanding how to use space to your advantage. So while it is visually impressive to see half the fucking screen taken up with baddies in Final Fight, it wasn't especially suited to my playstyle. Streets of Rage 2, however, gets the balance right. Big, bold sprites, plenty of enemies on the screen, but still enough real estate to be able to navigate into position to attack and defend effectively. Animations, backgrounds and graphical effects have all been improved from the original too, and it really must be said how much of a step up this is from the first one, especially considering it's barely 12 months or so after the arrival of the original. The other big change is in the combat moves. For a start, the special move system is totally different in Streets of Rage 2. Gone is the limited use eSWAT cop car that you can call in to shoot a flaming rocket against your foes, and in its place is a dual special move for each character that you can use at any time, in exchange for some of your health bar. While that is a very Final Fight-esque system, it absolutely works as intended. Because it can be deployed while you are stunned, it's quick and a tactical way to get some enemies off you. Simply tapping the A button unleashes a brief, multi-directional attack that will get any enemy away from you. Holding left or right while pressing the A button will do more of a flurry kind of attack, which can deal some serious damage to stronger or boss enemies. And the other key combat difference in Streets of Rage 2 is the blitz move. This is performed by double tapping a direction on the D-pad, immediately followed by the attack button. Each character has a very different move for this input, and to be honest, the quality of them is very different too. For Axel, as an example, he does a powerful uppercut which will land multiple strong hits on an opponent, while I think he shouts "Grand Upper." His blitz move is an absolute game changer, as this move is so overpowered that it makes little sense to do any other attack during the game. Skate, on the other hand, skates across the screen and launches himself into a somersault to take down enemies from range. While clearly not as devastating or as OP as Axel's move, it means you need a different playstyle for Skate. There's far more variation in the 4 playable characters than there were in the original, which makes for a much better replay value. So graphical and combat improvements aside, the main premise of Streets of Rage 2 continues to be walk along, beat the living shit out of everyone, pick up some cash bags and some gold bars, and the occasional snack for health, wallop the shit out of enemies' faces with various weapons, and fight your way through to Mr. X's new office and murder him again. In that sense, very little has changed. But as I mentioned in the first video, this is a tried and tested formula. Great sequels don't need to rewrite a genre, or piss away everything that made the original great. It's just got to build on it. And Streets of Rage 2 does just that. Aside from the graphics and the combat I've covered, there's lots of nice little quality of life updates. The special move system means you can now be more tactical. Using a special move isn't an all or nothing thing anymore. Every single enemy has their own name, and more importantly, their own health bar. Unlike the original where it was just bosses who had health indicators. The extra storage space on the cart means sound effects are hugely improved from the original. Punches, suplexes, throws and lead pipes on skulls have a much more weighty and satisfying noise to accompany them. Side-scrolling beat-em-ups aren't the most complex or really the most challenging of games, but there is something incredibly satisfying about them. As a kid, if you had a really bad day, it was a great way to let off some steam. As a competitor to my big brother, it was a perfect game to fight to the death on. And as a buddy to my big brother, it was probably the most quintessential co-op game we owned. Taking the time to learn how to optimise every aspect of the game, when to pick up a weapon, when to jump and press down to attack into a stun in order to immediately grab and throw an enemy. Honestly, I couldn't tell you how many times I beat this game. And playing through it over 30 years since launch, and I immediately remembered the patterns, the stages, the bosses, the multiple elevator sections, the ending. Everything came flooding back to me in an instant. It's like muscle memory kicked in and I immediately felt absolutely at home again with Streets of Rage 2. And again, there's the soundtrack. I mean, I love the first one, but Yuzo Koshiro absolutely nails it for Streets of Rage 2. Koshiro developed the soundtrack in a self-developed programming language called Music Love, and composed it using a PC-88 computer. It's heavily inspired by EDM again, but it just has to be said how fucking brilliant it is, mixing different dance influences like techno, house and breakbeat into one utterly scintillating audio pleasure. This was the first video game that I used the background music test in the options to turn my MegaDrive and TV into a sound system as a kid. Lay on my bed, reading a copy of Mean Machines whilst the game pumped out music for me. Honestly, I don't think it's possible to have a discussion about best video game soundtrack without mentioning Streets of Rage 2, because it really is that good. And to be honest, I don't think you can have an honest discussion about best beat-em-up or even best Mega Drive game without Streets of Rage 2 featuring predominantly in that discussion. Without doubt, this is one of the finest examples of this genre that there is, and it is one of my favourite Mega Drive games ever made. For me, this game is the perfection of the beat-em-up. There's 4 very different characters to experience. The action comes thick and fast. The game is a breeze on easy and nightmarishly difficult on the hardest setting. Graphically, it's brilliant. The soundtrack is brilliant. It's so responsive, it's so intuitive with putting combos together, and there's such good variety throughout the game. There's 2-player, there's even 2-player versus mode. Everything about this game oozes quality. And if you've never played a 2D side-scrolling beat-em-up, and you want to play the best 2D side-scrolling beat-em-up of the era, then play Streets of Rage 2. This one isn't just a stone cold classic, it's absolutely fucking brilliant. Thanks again for watching. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments about Streets of Rage 2. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Are you able to name something better that I've missed? Let me know in the comments. And if you've got a retro game you want me to give the retrospective treatment to, please let me know and I might just make it. Likes and subscribes are always appreciated. You can now support my work on Ko-Fi or Ko-Fi, however you want to say it, either as a one-off or a small recurring monthly donation. I would of course be eternally... Did you see what I did there? Grateful to you. Until next time, be awesome to each other, and I unconditionally love your hecking faces.